What if the very person who shattered your dreams became the one you were forced to call husband? In a quiet, remote village in India, where tradition governs every corner of life, a young girl dared to dream beyond the boundaries imposed upon her. She envisioned a world brimming with knowledge, a life where she could rise above poverty and carve her mark on a universe she had only glimpsed through stories. Her dreams were vibrant, luminous with hope, but they would soon be cast aside, replaced by a reality far darker, more harrowing than she could ever have imagined. In this village, one man loomed as a figure of reverence, a presence no one dared to question. He was an elder, a patriarch who had earned the community's unwavering trust over the years. She knew him as everyone else did, a symbol of wisdom, a beacon of guidance. But for her, he would become something far more sinister. When she sought protection, love, and support from her family and neighbors, she found only silence. A suffocating silence that pressed down on her, robbing her of even the faintest hope of escape. Trapped within the shadows of her own mind, something within her began to shift. She had no voice to cry out, no path to follow, only a memory she could never erase and a growing resolve forged in the fire of her anguish. What happens when a girl, stripped of every option, dares to take her fate into her own hands? In a small village far removed from the glittering lights of any city, lived a 16-year-old girl named Shahana. From an early age, Shahana was known for her quick mind and gentle spirit. She was the kind of girl who dreamed even in broad daylight, her thoughts often drifting far beyond the confines of her village. She imagined herself walking through the grand gates of a university, her arms cradling books, her future painted in vibrant colors, a life she longed for, filled with possibility. In her eyes, the world stretched wide, brimming with opportunities that could lift her far from the dusty fields where she had grown up. She yearned to escape the backbreaking labor that tethered her family to a life of unyielding struggle. But for Shahana, dreams were indulgences, a luxury her circumstances could scarcely afford. Her family's survival depended on the sweat of their brows. Her father, Harish, toiled under the blistering sun, breaking stones and hauling heavy loads, his hands scarred by years of relentless labor. Her mother, Priya, worked tirelessly in nearby homes, sweeping floors and scrubbing clothes, her back bent under the weight of their poverty. Together, they earned just enough to keep hunger at bay. Dreams of education, of freedom. Those were as distant as the stars glittering above their tiny village. And yet, Shahana clung to hope. Each night, after helping her mother with the evening chores, she would sit by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, poring over the handful of books she owned. Her intellect sparkled like a hidden gem. Her village schoolteacher often told her parents that a mind like hers, if given a chance, could soar. And though her parents swelled with quiet pride, they also carried a heavy burden of worry. How could they ever afford to send her away to study? How could they give her the life she so deserved when they barely had enough for themselves? Amid this backdrop of quiet struggle, a new presence began to weave itself into their lives. Nand Kishore, a 62-year-old village elder, emerged as an imposing figure. His hair, a cascade of silver, and his stern, unwavering gaze seemed to command respect without the need for words. His voice carried an authority that others accepted as law, his reputation built over decades of settling disputes and dispensing advice that many regarded as gospel. For Shahana, however, this man was no benevolent elder. He was a shadow that loomed larger with each passing day. Occasionally, Nand Kishore would lend money to those in desperate need, bolstering his image as a benefactor. But behind the carefully crafted mask of respectability, he was a man who wielded his influence for personal gain. To the outside world, Nand Kishore appeared to be a pillar of the community, a steadfast guardian of tradition, a man who commanded obedience and offered guidance. Yet, within the hushed corners of the village, whispered tales hinted at a far darker reality. He was feared and quietly resented by those who had glimpsed the true cost of his so-called generosity. Stories circulated of debts that ballooned over time, of favors wrapped in invisible chains, and of families bound to him for generations by obligations they could never repay. The villagers, while dependent on him, rarely trusted him. But they remained silent, shackled by fear, customs, and the undeniable reality that his power extended far beyond what any one of them could challenge. One fateful day, Nand Kishore paid a visit to Shahana's family. With an air of casual authority, he spoke to her father, Harish, about village matters, inquired about their well-being, and touched upon their struggles with a tone that seemed almost sympathetic. Harish, eager to maintain the elder's favor, invited him inside. His hands, though steady from years of labor, trembled ever so slightly as he poured a cup of tea. The two men spoke at length, and despite his unease, Harish found himself disarmed by Nand's concern. Here was a man with undeniable power, someone who just might have the means to help a family teetering on the edge of survival. As weeks turned into months, Nand Kishore's visits became more frequent. He would stop by under the guise of checking in on the family, often bearing small gifts, a sack of rice, a few precious coins. To the struggling family, these gestures felt like blessings, acts of generosity from a man whose status in the village seemed almost untouchable. Shahana's parents accepted his help with gratitude, unaware that they were walking directly into a web he had meticulously spun. Over time, Nand began speaking more openly about Shahana. He lavished praise on her intelligence and beauty, offering comments on her future as though it were his to decide. Shahana noticed the way his gaze lingered on her, an intensity in his eyes that unsettled her. A shiver of discomfort would run through her whenever he was near. Unable to keep her unease to herself, Shahana confided in her mother. But Priya dismissed her daughter's concerns, brushing them aside as the overactive imagination of a young girl. To Priya, Nand's attention seemed harmless, perhaps even flattering. He was, after all, an elder, a man of respect. In their world, deference to men like Nand was not a choice but a deeply ingrained obligation. Priya, like many others, had been raised to honor such figures without question. But Shahana's discomfort only grew. His visits became more invasive, his gaze more lingering, until one day, in a moment she would replay in her mind for years to come, Nand Kishore's supposed kindness revealed its true, insidious nature. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sun blazed high in the sky, its heat casting sharp, dancing shadows along the clay walls of their humble home. The village was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Shahana was alone, her parents out working to scrape together what little they could to keep the family afloat, her younger siblings visiting relatives. She busied herself with daily chores, her hands moving automatically as her mind drifted to distant dreams, dreams of school, of books, of a life where she could choose her own destiny. The monotony of her tasks was a stark contrast to the vivid images in her imagination, where the weight of her reality momentarily lifted. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the subtle shift in the air, the quiet before the storm that was about to engulf her. It was in that moment, surrounded by the flickering shadows of her modest home, that her life would begin to change in ways she could never have foreseen. She didn't hear the footsteps as they approached the door, the sound muffled by the quiet of the afternoon. When she looked up, there he was, Nand Kishore. His presence seemed to fill the small room, suffocating the air until it grew heavy, almost unbreathable. Shahana's heart stilled, her body stiffening instinctively. She greeted him politely, the way she had been taught to show respect to elders, her voice trembling despite her effort to appear composed. He offered a small smile, but it was hollow, his eyes cold, void of the warmth that should have accompanied such a gesture. He stepped further inside, his voice low as he asked her questions about her family, her chores, her day. Shahana answered, her words clipped and cautious, her gaze flickering away from his penetrating stare. A chill crawled down her spine despite the oppressive heat of the afternoon. Then his tone shifted. The questions became invasive, prying into matters that sent discomfort prickling through her skin. She tried to excuse herself, moving toward the door with a hurried step, but he blocked her path effortlessly. In that moment, the weight of his authority bore down on her like a crushing force. She looked up, her wide eyes searching his face for some semblance of the man the village revered, a flicker of the respect others claimed to see in him. Instead, she found only a gaze as cold and unyielding as forged iron. He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her like a dark cloud. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, a chilling understanding that filled her with dread. She tried to back away, her body trembling as she moved instinctively to protect herself, but his hand shot out. It was rough, calloused, unkind as it gripped her arm, holding her in place. Panic surged through her, her chest tightening as her mind raced, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. She was alone, utterly powerless against the man whose authority shielded him from any scrutiny. Her protests, whispered and then louder, were swallowed by the walls of the room and the overpowering weight of his presence. In those harrowing moments, her world crumbled. The trust she had once held in her elders, her community, her family, all of it was torn apart, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. He violated her, stealing her innocence, her hope, her very sense of self. Despite her youth, despite her pleas, Nand Kishore destroyed her. When it was over, she lay on the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling. A numbness spread through her, creeping like a shadow over every corner of her mind. The warmth of the sunlight filtering through the window mocked her, casting a harsh glare on the hollowness she now felt inside. She couldn't cry. She couldn't scream. She was paralyzed by the weight of her own pain. Days blurred into one another as Shahana tried to carry on. She went about her chores mechanically, her mind clouded with shame, confusion, and anger. She felt as though the very walls of the village had witnessed her suffering and remained silent. Everywhere she turned, she was haunted by the suffocating sense that everyone knew, that they saw her pain and chose to look away. Her dreams, once bright and alive, now seemed like distant, unreachable stars. It wasn't long before her body betrayed the truth she wished to deny. The nausea, the exhaustion, the changes she couldn't ignore, all pointed to a devastating reality. She was carrying the child of the man who had ruined her. The news spread quickly, and the whispers that had once followed her in hushed tones turned into open murmurs of outrage and condemnation. For the first time, the village could no longer ignore what had happened. A girl, one of their own, had been violated. Nand Kishore, the man they respected, the man they had looked up to for years, had committed an act so vile that even the elders began to question his standing among them. He was arrested, his authority stripped away, leaving him exposed for what he truly was. For a brief moment, Shahana felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a hope that justice might finally be served, that perhaps she could find some measure of peace in the aftermath of her suffering. But the hope was fleeting. Nand Kishore's influence ran deeper than she had imagined. The village, though momentarily shaken, began to fall back into its old patterns. Her parents, already poor and vulnerable, felt the pressure from the whispers, the judgmental glances of their neighbors. Friends and relatives urged them to resolve the matter quietly, to consider the consequences of challenging someone as powerful as Nand. Shahana watched helplessly as her family's resolve crumbled under the weight of the village's expectations. Her father, Harish, who had once demanded justice with a voice full of conviction, grew quieter with each passing day, avoiding her gaze. Her mother, Priya, who had promised that they would fight, now whispered to her in the dead of night, urging her to let it go, to think of their family's survival. The villagers, too, fell silent. Those who had whispered their sympathies now looked the other way, unwilling to confront the elders' power. Even the women, those who might have understood her pain, remained complicit, their eyes averted out of fear or deference to tradition. In the end, Nand Kishore was released. He returned to the village with a smugness that was impossible to ignore, his face lined with the quiet assurance of a man who believed himself untouchable. The respect he once commanded was tarnished, replaced by an uneasy fear. But fear was no justice. For Shahana, the release marked the final blow to her fragile hope. She had learned a brutal truth: in her world, justice was a privilege reserved for the powerful, a concept far removed from the life of a girl who had dared to dream beyond her means. The village moved on, but Shahana's world remained frozen in the moment it had all fallen apart. Nand Kishore's release was a cruel reminder of the power he still held, over the village, over her family, and over Shahana's very existence. For her, it was the final blow that shattered any remaining illusions she had about fairness or justice. The world she had once dreamed of, where right triumphed over wrong, now felt like a distant, unattainable fantasy. She was forced to watch him walk free, to see him carry on as if nothing had happened, while she bore the crushing weight of decisions made not by her, but for her, decisions that condemned her to a life of shame, isolation, and silence. His release cast a heavy shadow over her family. Harish and Priya carried the burden of their daughter's plight, but they were bound by the twin chains of poverty and the unspoken rules of their village. They lacked the resources to fight Nan's power and had no way to escape the relentless whispers and stares that followed them wherever they went. Each day, they heard the murmurs of neighbors who insisted that Shahana should be dealt with, that her presence, young, pregnant, and unwed, brought disgrace to their family. As her pregnancy became more visible, their desperation deepened. Harish and Priya, already stretched thin by the demands of their daily labor, could barely put food on the table. Now, with another mouth to feed, the strain felt unbearable. They worried about how they could care for a daughter who, by village judgment, was now considered ruined. The looming costs of raising both her and her unborn child seemed insurmountable. The whispers grew louder, pressing them toward the only solution that seemed to satisfy the oppressive expectations of the community, marriage. Even to the man who had inflicted such suffering on their daughter. Harish tried to convince himself that this decision might provide Shahana with some semblance of stability in a society that had already cast her aside. Priya clung to the thought that, with Nan's means, at least Shahana and her child wouldn't go hungry. But the reality was far grimmer. They simply couldn't afford to support her and the child. They had nothing left to give, and the weight of potential disgrace bore down on them like an iron shackle. In the end, surrendering to fear and scarcity, they agreed to marry Shahana to Nand Kishore, telling themselves it was the only way to save her from a lifetime of social condemnation, and to spare themselves economic ruin. On the day of the wedding, Shahana, just 16 years old, walked down the dusty path toward her new life with a heart heavy with sorrow and betrayal. She felt abandoned by the very people who should have shielded her, condemned by the hands that should have lifted her up. The village watched in silence, their gazes a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction, as if the ceremony could somehow erase the past and restore the fragile sense of order their community clung to. To Shahana, it was the deepest betrayal, a final act of surrender that forced her to submit to the man who had shattered her dreams and stolen her innocence. Life with Nand Kishore was nothing like what her parents had hoped. He saw her not as a wife, not as a partner, and not even as the mother of his child, but as a possession. There was no tenderness in his gaze, no kindness in his actions. He treated her as though her body, her will, and her very existence were his alone to command. Every day became an unrelenting cycle of obedience and silence. Nand demanded service without complaint, submission without resistance, and respect without earning it. The walls of his home became her prison, each corner a reminder of the freedom she had lost. When her first child was born, a baby girl, Shahana felt a fleeting flicker of joy, a fragile sense of purpose as she cradled the infant in her arms. But that joy was quickly overshadowed by Nand's indifference. To him, a daughter was worthless, an unwelcome burden he paid little attention to. He showed no interest in the child, offering neither support nor affection. Shahana was left to care for her baby on her own, scraping together what little she could to ensure her child had enough to eat. The weight of her new reality soon began to take its toll. Exhaustion seeped into her bones, her health deteriorating under the strain of relentless labor and emotional isolation. Her dreams, once vibrant and full of hope, now seemed like distant memories, a world she no longer had the strength to imagine. Constantly struggling to care for her child under Nand Kishore's unrelenting neglect, Shahana soon found herself pregnant again. The news felt like a cruel twist of fate, another reminder of her powerlessness. This second pregnancy was harder, her body weaker, her spirit more worn, but Nand showed no concern for her or the child she carried. To him, her well-being was nothing more than an afterthought, a trivial detail that barely registered in his world of authority and dominance. Left to manage on her own, to cope and endure in silence, Shahana's resentment deepened. She spent long, lonely hours reflecting on the life she had once dared to dream of, a life filled with education, choices, and love. That life now seemed like a distant, unreachable mirage. She saw the way he looked at her, his gaze devoid of warmth or care, holding only the expectation of unquestioning submission. The weight of her parents' decision and the crushing reality of their poverty pressed down on her like an iron chain, binding her to this man who saw her as little more than an object. But with every passing day, her sorrow began to transform. It sharpened into something fiercer, more potent, a quiet, simmering hatred that took root deep within her heart. Each act of neglect, each cruel reminder of what she had lost, only strengthened this flame. The dreams of happiness that had once fueled her were extinguished, replaced by the grim certainty that her life would remain chained to a man who viewed her as nothing more than a possession. Yet, beneath the silence, behind the dutiful mask she wore, Shahana's spirit remained unbroken. Her heart, now a furnace of resentment, kept its fire burning. In the depths of her suffering, she made a vow to herself: one day, she would reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Years passed, heavy with unspoken pain. Shahana found herself growing increasingly distant from the life she had once known. She felt like a stranger in her own body, her own home, her own village. The friends who once shared her laughter now avoided her, their faces clouded with pity or quiet judgment. Even her family, though physically nearby, seemed a world away. Their fragile peace had been purchased at the unbearable cost of her freedom. The dreams that once filled her heart, dreams of studying, of walking through the gates of a university, of building a life full of choice and love, had become nothing more than ghosts. They haunted her in the quiet of the night, only to vanish with the first light of dawn. Shahana was utterly alone. Her days were spent in silence, tending to her children, enduring Nand Kishore's cold, overbearing presence and his constant reminders of her submission. Her marriage felt less like a union and more like a prison sentence. Isolated and voiceless, her heart became a hollow echo of the girl she once was. Each night, as she lay in the suffocating darkness, she felt the weight of her sorrow pressing down on her, threatening to consume her entirely. The life she had been forced into was a relentless cage, its walls closing in tighter with every passing day. She had no one to confide in, no one to share her suffering, no one to lighten the crushing burden of her pain. But as the years wore on, something within Shahana began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a quiet rebellion flickering deep in her heart, unnoticed by anyone around her. She found herself increasingly unable to endure Nan's commands with the same silent compliance. Her gaze, once perpetually lowered in submission, began to rise. She looked him in the eye with a defiance that simmered just beneath the surface. When he ordered her to serve him, she took an extra moment, letting the silence stretch, a silence that challenged his authority in ways words never could. Her stillness, deliberate and charged, became her first act of resistance. She began to refuse in small, almost imperceptible ways, a pause too long, a look that spoke louder than any argument ever could, a refusal to shrink under his gaze. To anyone else, these acts were insignificant, meaningless gestures in a life governed by oppression. But to Shahana, they were victories, tiny, precious moments of reclaiming the control that had been stripped from her. With every glance that refused to cower, with every deliberate action, she reminded herself that she was not entirely defeated, that her spirit, battered but unyielding, had not yet been broken. She began to move through the house with a quiet but resolute determination. Each step was deliberate, each motion a reminder to herself of the strength she still carried within. Her defiance was silent but powerful, an internal rebellion that no one else could see but that fueled her resolve. With every small act of resistance, her hatred for Nand Kishore grew. This hatred, no longer a passive resentment, began to solidify into something stronger, a force that sustained her. She realized that her life, though bound by chains, was not entirely out of her hands. The fire inside her was growing, and with it, the determination to take back what had been stolen. Shahana knew that one day, when the time was right, her defiance would no longer be quiet. One day, she would rise. Shahana no longer saw Nand Kishore as an elder, nor as her husband. To her, he had become the living embodiment of everything stolen from her, the dreams that had been snatched away, the love and connections she had been isolated from, and the life that had become a hollow imitation of what it should have been. He was the reason her world had collapsed, the reason her freedom had been extinguished. The hatred she felt for him was like a seed planted deep in her soul, its roots spreading and growing stronger with every passing day, with every insult, with every reminder of what she had lost. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. She would sit by the small window of her home, staring at the world outside, watching the promise she once believed in slip further and further from her grasp. She realized that there was no escape, no future beyond the suffocating walls of her marriage, no chance of reclaiming the life she had been forced to leave behind. Her parents had closed their eyes to her suffering, her village had passed its cruel judgment, and she was left with nothing but the cold, unshakable certainty that her life would begin and end as it was now, bound, silenced, unseen. In the stillness of those endless days, Shahana's mind began to drift toward darker thoughts. She imagined a world without Nand Kishore, a world free of his shadow, his suffocating control. She envisioned the life she could have lived if he had never entered it, the paths she could have walked if he hadn't stolen everything from her. These thoughts, though fleeting at first, grew sharper and more vivid, giving rise to a realization that chilled and electrified her. Perhaps her only escape was through him. Her resentment, once a simmering undercurrent, hardened into something sharper, something dangerous. She no longer wished for quiet rebellion or passive resistance. She wanted freedom, true, unshackled freedom, and she understood now that the only way to achieve it was to rid herself of the man who had become her prison. Her thoughts turned to revenge, her heart steeling itself with each passing day, with each command he barked, with each expectation of her submission. In the quiet of her mind, Shahana's plan began to take form. She waited, biding her time, her every action carefully measured, her every glance disguising the storm that brewed within. The hatred that had been her silent companion now became her driving force, propelling her forward with a singular, unyielding purpose. Though she continued to live as Nand expected, silent, obedient, bound, there was a glint in her eye, a spark in her heart, a hidden strength that lay just beneath the surface, waiting. Shahana was no longer the helpless girl he had overpowered. She was now a woman forged in the fires of suffering, a woman who had tasted the bitterness of betrayal and had been pushed to the very edge of her endurance. And she was ready. Ready to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, ready to break the chains that bound her, ready to take back the control that had been stripped from her. In her silence, she plotted. Her hatred fueled a resolve that grew stronger with every passing moment, a resolve that would, one day, find its release. The night Shahana had been waiting for finally arrived. Moving through the shadows of her home, she carried herself with a silent determination. Each step was deliberate, every movement precise. The day had unfolded like any other, but there was an eerie stillness about her, a calm that settled over her like a veil. She had watched Nand Kishore carefully, noting the times he sat, the times he ate, and the moment he finally retreated to his room for the night. Her resolve was unshakable, her plan meticulous, her heart steady amidst the silence. She had prepared everything down to the smallest detail. The children were asleep, their tiny breaths soft and even in the stillness of the night. Standing in their doorway, Shahana lingered for a moment, her gaze tracing the lines of their peaceful faces. For an instant, her hardened expression softened, a fleeting moment of love for the lives she had worked so desperately to protect in the only way she knew how. But the softness was short-lived. Her heart hardened again as she turned away, her mind refocusing on the task ahead. The time for mourning what she had lost was over. Now was the time to act. Shahana made her way to the kitchen, her movements swift and precise, each one carrying the weight of her determination. This night was hers. It was the night she would free herself, the night she would reclaim her stolen life, the night she would rise from the ashes of her suffering. Her silent rebellion, years in the making, was finally ready to erupt. Her fingers closed around the handle of the knife, its cold, unyielding weight grounding her amidst the storm of emotions within. The smooth, cool metal was a stark contrast to the inferno burning inside her. She held it steady, her grip tightening as memories surged, every insult, every unwanted touch, every stolen moment of happiness etched into her mind like scars. Her body was still, her breaths measured, her mind as sharp and focused as the blade she now wielded. This was the night that would alter everything. Fear had no place here. Hesitation had long been burned away, replaced by a cold, unyielding certainty forged in the crucible of years of torment. The house was cloaked in silence, the oppressive darkness broken only by faint strands of moonlight spilling through the windows. As she moved toward the room where Nand Kishore slept, each step was deliberate, her bare feet soundless against the cool floor. She paused at the doorway, her silhouette a faint shadow in the dim glow of moonlight. Her eyes fixed on him as he lay there, oblivious, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Each breath he took seemed to mock her, a reminder of the control he had exerted over her life, the years of suffering he had forced her to endure. But tonight, those breaths would be his last as a free man. Shahana stepped forward, her movements fluid, her gaze unwavering. Her eyes were cold, detached, her heart an impenetrable fortress of hatred and resolve. The knife gleamed faintly as she raised it, the blade catching a sliver of moonlight. She positioned herself beside him, her grip firm, her resolve unshakable. There was no tremor in her hand, no hesitation in her movements. Years of bottled-up rage, anguish, and silence coalesced into this single moment. With calm, calculated precision, she brought the knife down. The blade pierced flesh, cutting through the stillness of the night as though slicing through the years of her torment. Her expression remained unchanged, her breath steady, her eyes unblinking. Again and again, she struck, each movement deliberate, each thrust of the blade an act of release, a reclamation of the life that had been stolen from her. Her hand moved with purpose, her grip unwavering as though guided by the pain, anger, and sorrow that had lived within her for so long. Each cut felt like breaking a chain, each stab an assertion of her freedom. The room remained cloaked in silence, save for the faint, rhythmic sound of her breathing, measured, deliberate, unshaken. With every motion, she felt the weight of the years lifting, the burden of her suffering dissipating. Her body grew lighter, her heart calmer, her soul finally at peace. As she stood over him, her eyes empty of pity and her mind clear, the enormity of what she had done settled upon her. She had reclaimed what he had stolen from her, piece by piece, strike by strike. The stillness in the room was charged with an intense finality, the air thick with the quiet, irreversible truth of her actions. Shahana looked down at him, now motionless, and a profound realization washed over her. She was free. The man who had haunted her days, tormented her nights, and chained her existence to his will was gone. In that moment, she was no longer his captive, no longer his possession. She was herself again, a woman who had taken back her life, who had broken free from the silence and oppression that had defined her existence. She stepped back, her breathing calm, her heart steady. The weight of her past seemed to fall away, dissolving into the shadows of the room. The house was quiet, undisturbed by the violence that had unfolded within its walls, as though the world outside remained blissfully unaware of what had transpired. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, spilling soft hues of gold and pink over the rooftops, Shahana turned and walked away. She left behind the darkness, the pain, and the chains of her old life, stepping forward into a future that, for the first time, was entirely her own. The dawn broke quietly over the village, its gentle light casting shadows along the narrow streets. But for Shahana, it was a new beginning, a day that carried the promise of freedom, the promise of a life no longer defined by fear, but by hope. As the first light of dawn spilled over the rooftops of the village, painting the narrow pathways with soft hues, a heavy silence lingered inside Nand Kishore's home. It was an unnatural stillness, clinging to the walls and suffocating the air, as though the house itself held its breath. The quiet went unnoticed at first, until later that morning when the villagers gathered for their daily routines. A young boy, sent to summon Nand Kishore for an early meeting, hesitated as he approached the elder's door. The eerie silence unsettled him, making his small hand falter mid-knock. When no answer came, he pushed the door open cautiously. His eyes widened in shock as they landed on Nand's lifeless body. The once commanding presence now lay utterly still, a strange, haunting stillness that sent panic coursing through the boy. Within moments, the news spread like wildfire, rippling across the village. Villagers crowded around Nand's home, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Some stood frozen in silence, hands over their mouths, while others murmured in hushed tones, their eyes darting from face to face, searching for answers. For a man of such stature, a man respected, feared, and revered by many, this was unthinkable. Nand Kishore, the elder who had shaped so many lives, lay lifeless, his final hours shrouded in mystery. Whispers began to grow, and as the villagers pieced together fragments of what they knew about Nand's life, especially his recent years with Shahana, a darker narrative began to take shape. The villagers had always whispered quietly, their suspicions muted by fear and tradition, about the circumstances that had brought Shahana into Nand's household. They had noticed her suffering, her silent obedience, the way she moved as though burdened by an unseen weight. Now, for the first time, some dared to voice what they had long suspected, that this was no accident. Perhaps the man who had wielded so much power over Shahana's life had finally met his end at her hands. As whispers spread, the villagers began to divide. Some spoke in hushed tones, claiming that Nand Kishore's actions had finally caught up with him. They murmured that Shahana had been a victim, forced into a life of submission and silence, and that this was her way of reclaiming the life she had been denied. These villagers viewed her not as a criminal, but as a woman pushed to the edge, who had finally fought back against an unyielding oppressor. Others, however, were horrified. To them, Shahana's actions were unthinkable, a betrayal of tradition and respect. Many who had benefited from Nand's influence, who saw him as a pillar of authority, refused to accept that he could be anything other than the revered elder they had known. To them, Shahana was not a victim reclaiming her life, she was a murderer, someone who had committed an unforgivable act, regardless of her circumstances. When the authorities arrived, they began their investigation with cold, methodical precision. They combed through the house, piecing together the evidence that would inevitably lead them to Shahana. Bloodstains traced a path through the home, and faint fingerprints marked the places where she had steadied herself during the fateful night. Each trace was a silent testament to her calculated actions, a roadmap of the years of suffering that had culminated in this one moment. Shahana did not flee. She did not resist. When they came for her, she stood with an unsettling calm that unnerved the villagers. Her expression was unreadable, her posture unflinching. During questioning, she answered plainly, her voice quiet yet unwavering. When asked about her motives, Shahana did not hide the truth. She spoke with a chilling clarity, recounting the years of torment, the stolen dreams, the resentment that had simmered until it became a force she could no longer contain. Her words peeled back the layers of her suffering, exposing the raw truth of her existence. She did not speak as a criminal, but as a woman who had endured too much, a woman stripped of everything until only her resolve remained. Her tone was steady, her words deliberate, each one a revelation that shattered the image of Nand Kishore the villagers had held onto for so long. The legal proceedings that followed were a tangled web of tradition, authority, and justice in a community where such matters were rarely questioned. The village elders, many of whom had once revered Nand Kishore, found themselves grappling with the duality of the man they had known. How could they reconcile the respected figure they had looked up to with the dark truths that had come to light? As the trial unfolded, the village itself became a battleground. Some elders and villagers argued that Shahana's actions were the inevitable result of years of oppression, that she had been driven to the edge by a man who had stripped her of her freedom and dignity. Others clung to the sanctity of tradition, condemning her actions as a violation of the respect owed to elders and authority figures, regardless of their faults. Through it all, Shahana remained unyielding. She did not seek pity, nor did she beg for understanding. Her silence spoke volumes, her calm demeanor unnerving even those who judged her most harshly. To some, she was a villain, to others, a tragic heroine. But to herself, she was something else entirely, a woman who had taken back her life, piece by agonizing piece, from a man who had stolen everything from her. The truths revealed through Shahana's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. The villagers heard of the abuse she endured, the forced marriage that bound her, and the isolation that caged her for years. Yet, the notion of a woman taking justice into her own hands unsettled them deeply. For many, tradition held an almost sacred weight, and even in death, Nand Kishore seemed to wield a power that could not be easily discarded. The courtroom became a battleground of ideals, a clash between unwavering loyalty to tradition and the pursuit of justice. Some village elders spoke in her defense, painting a vivid picture of her suffering, of the years of mistreatment that had broken her spirit. Others condemned her with sharp, unforgiving words, accusing her of shattering the very fabric of their community. They argued that no matter her suffering, she had crossed an unspoken line, one that forbade anyone, especially a woman, from stepping outside the rigid social order. Outside, villagers gathered, their ears straining to catch the echoes of the trial. Every word sparked fresh debates, dividing friends and families. Some argued she deserved freedom, that her actions were more than justified in ending the life of the man who had stolen hers. Others insisted she had gone too far, claiming vengeance, no matter the pain that drove it, could never be excused. Through it all, Shahana remained silent. Her gaze was steady, her face a calm mask amidst the storm of opinions swirling around her. She had spoken her truth and had no more to say. Her motives had been laid bare, her suffering exposed to those who had turned a blind eye for so long. She did not beg for mercy, nor did she attempt to justify herself beyond the facts. In that small courtroom, under the scrutinizing eyes of her accusers, defenders, and silent onlookers, Shahana's story became more than just her own, it became a test of justice, a mirror reflecting the darkness and flaws within the village's traditions. The villagers held their breath as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, a decision that would forever echo through their community. Tradition clashed against justice, authority battled compassion. Everyone knew that whatever the outcome, it would leave an indelible mark on the village. Shahana was sentenced to 15 years in confinement, a decision that walked a precarious line between punishment and understanding. The judge acknowledged her suffering, the years of entrapment, and the torment that had driven her to such drastic action. It was clear he saw her not as a common criminal but as a woman pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The reaction in the village was as divided as ever. Some were outraged, unable to reconcile what they saw as leniency with their rigid notions of justice. To them, tradition and order had been betrayed, and no amount of suffering could excuse what Shahana had done. Others, particularly those who had long sympathized with her plight, felt bittersweet relief. While she would face years behind bars, there was an understanding that her suffering had not gone unnoticed. She was more than her actions, she was a symbol of resilience against an oppressive system. As Shahana was led away, her gaze remained calm, her step steady. The weight of her punishment was nothing compared to the years of torment she had already endured. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of liberation, as though the walls that had confined her for so long had finally crumbled. Shahana's story lingered in the minds of the villagers and beyond, raising questions that could not be easily answered. Could this tragedy have been avoided? If her family had been met with compassion instead of judgment, if her cries for help had not been ignored, would her life have taken a different path? Her parents, driven by desperation and poverty, had made unimaginable choices. Yet, could that desperation ever justify giving their daughter to the man who had destroyed her innocence? The village remained deeply divided. Some saw Shahana as a tragic figure, a woman who had suffered in silence until she could endure no more. To them, her actions were not the result of malice but of years of trauma and betrayal, a culmination of the deep scars inflicted upon her. They viewed her not as a murderer, but as a victim of a broken system, a society that turned its back on her suffering and allowed her abuse to continue unchecked. Others, however, could not look beyond her final act. They saw only the violence of that night and condemned her as a criminal. To them, she had crossed an unforgivable line. Desperation, they argued, could not excuse taking a life. Her actions, in their eyes, represented a betrayal of tradition, a violation of the values that bound their community together. The moral ambiguity of Shahana's story defied any simple judgment. Was her act justified? Could anyone truly understand the depths of her trauma and despair? The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving the village, and anyone who heard her story, grappling with the uncomfortable reality that justice is rarely simple or absolute. The echoes of Shahana's story rippled through the village, forcing it to confront the consequences of unchecked authority, the quiet acceptance of abuse, and the societal indifference that had silenced her. Her tragedy became a haunting reflection of the world around her, a reminder of the cost of turning a blind eye to suffering. When does self-defense become justice? And when does it become a crime? Could Shahana's suffering have been prevented if her family's pleas for help had been heard? If her community had found shame in their complicity instead of judgment for her actions? If the pain she endured had been acknowledged before it consumed her? Shahana's story serves as a painful reminder that the scars of trauma run deep and that no one should be left to bear the weight of abuse alone. It asks hard questions of justice and tradition, exposing the cracks in a system that allows lives to unravel under the guise of order. It leaves us with the uncomfortable truth that when society fails to protect its most vulnerable, tragedies like hers become inevitable. Let her story remind us that silence, complicity, and indifference have a cost too high for any community to bear.